Uh, I got back from my cross-country road trip, and this is going to be a maybe a long review because I'm going to cover kind of a lot of things here. Just a quick note: if you hear background noise, the wife is watching her TVs. I've got the door shut, so just kind of ignore that. Anyways, okay, so from June 11th through July 3rd, which is today, as a matter of fact, the wife and I did a cross country road trip. We wanted to drive from South Carolina all the way to Washington State and back. And we visited a lot of places. We went to like Asheville, stayed there for a little bit. Gatlinburg, we love Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge. Great place um, to go. And then we went, we drove to Colorado. We drove to Idaho Falls, and then to Washington State, and then back through Utah, Colorado, OKC, and then all the way back up to South Carolina. So this is going to be kind of long review. I'm going to put timestamps so that you guys can, um, if you want to fast forward to certain things, you guys can do that. So let's go ahead and get into it. So this is going to be the agenda. It'll be bottom line up front, as well as overall performance and driving experience. I'm going to touch on miles per gallon and regens, and I did get the Titan tank installed. As well as I got a new EzLynk 2.0, which is great, by the way. I highly recommend everyone get that, and I'm going to talk about that too. So okay, so bottom line up front, and overall performance. So this image here is the truck when we got to Lacey, Washington. Uh, this here is the overall. You can see the mileage here, 36,449 miles on the truck now. Basically, I drove 6,500 miles total because I think I changed my oil at 29.5 or 6 or something. Started the trip at around maybe a little bit before 30,000 miles. So yeah, I put on roughly 6,500 miles for this entire trip, and no major issues at all. I mean, no issues at all. Period. And the highest recorded MPGs is 34, and I'm going to get to that. I did a lot of hyper milling. Let's put it that way. Particularly on the way back because I got the Titan tank installed and I wanted to see how far I can go before I, get to empty. So, and I'm going to talk about all of that. But again, bottom line up front, and overall performance and driving experience, no major issues. I drove 6,500 miles. Truck got phenomenal fuel mileage. Um, and I can't complain. I mean, the truck did great. Um, it was smooth. It was just a good driving experience. Now, I I do wish that the truck had massaging seats like the Ford because sitting in these Ram, I will say that Ram has really hard seats because they use really tough leather. I mean, but it's durable, right? It'll last you like forever if you take care of it. But they're really hard seats. So I guess if there was an issue, it would be that. The Ford, my 2020 Ford, my 19 Ford, and my 17 Ford, man, they were comfortable, and the massaging seats were great. So that is something that I wish Ram had, but that's okay. Other than that, no issues. The engine performed great. The transmission was great. Um, everything, even down to like steering and overall, um, I guess driving experience. Going over potholes, different terrains, up and down mountains. I mean, it was great. The exhaust brake, I love the exhaust brake, and let me tell you, for Ford owners who have never owned a Ram, the exhaust brake on the Cummins is the best. First, Ram and Cummins were the first to put an exhaust brake um, in a pickup truck. Ford that came later with Ford and with GM, but Ram was the first to do it. And the exhaust brake is great, even when not towing. 'Cause I wasn't towing anything. I just drove the truck and did a cross country trip with it, and the exhaust brake is fantastic. And if you want to, having a more exhaust brake, I turn on tow haul, and it really slows you down on the mountains, especially going over the Rockies and the Cascade Mountains, and I mean, and so forth, right? All the mountain ranges that we crossed over, the Appalachia and so forth, right? So the exhaust brake on the Cummins is phenomenal. Ford, I would say the Ford exhaust brake is probably better than the GM, because I've driven GM with their exhaust brake and the Duramax, and it's not that great. Ford is better, and then Ram is the best, period. So that's that. So yeah, so we're going to continue on. So that's bottom out up front. Okay, mileage and regens. So something, one, the highest recorded fuel mileage was 34, and you can see that right here. It's actually on the way back, the 2nd of July. I drove 258.7 miles, filled up 7.6 gallons. That was 34 miles to the gallon. Now, I was doing some major hyper milling. Normally, I on the way to Washington, I didn't really care. I was doing 75 miles per hour or 80, but I had my cruise set at 75 for the most part, for like most of the trip, because I wanted to, just kind of. And not only that, as you can see here, I was driving, every few hours or so, filling up at 255 miles, 200 miles, and so forth. So it'd be like 3-4 hours I would fill up, kind of simulating, like EV drivers, right? Because you guys, your electric vehicles can only drive, I would say, especially if you're towing, right? Anywhere between 80 to maybe 150 miles at the most when towing, right? But really, it's like 80 miles. I mean, TFL truck proved that it's like 80 miles. But if you're not towing, or if you got a regular EV, I mean, you could probably go between 100, I would say 180 and maybe 250, maybe 300 miles on a full charge. TFL truck did that. They did this video a couple days ago, maybe a week ago, about the Lightning, and they had it at a full charge, but it only read 280 miles of distance. That's awful. That's awful. And, they say that you have to charge between 1 hour and maybe 2 hours to get maybe 100 extra miles of range. That's awful. When you got places to be, you don't want to spend an hour or two every time you stop. And I'm going to get into that in another video. I'm going to do another video where I go over EVs versus the reality of driving long distance. Because let me give you like a little sneak peek, right? After I got my Titan tank and I was done on the West Coast, I was like, I wanted to get home. We spent 10 days going from South Carolina to Washington State. And that's because we hit places, like we wanted to see certain things, right? But when we were basically done, I wanted to get home as quickly as possible. And you can see here, particularly this last stretch, I drove 1,040 miles on one tank of fuel. It took me like a little over 15 hours worth of driving. Yes, we had pee breaks. Every 3 hours we would stop and pee, and that was like 5 minutes, right? But like, I imagine I'm trying to get home because I'm tired of being on the road. I mean, I was like tired. I was like, I'm done, right? But I wanted to get home, and I don't want to sit here and charge a vehicle to only, because they say only charge to 80%, and you may get another 100 miles worth of driving, right? Because driving conditions changes that depending on how fast you drive. If you're driving uphill, if you're driving against the wind, right? And I don't like that feeling of, am I gonna make it to the next station to fill up or charge, right? Because let me tell you something, when I was driving across country, particularly in some of these areas, like I didn't see any charging stations within like 500 miles. I mean, I don't, for your city people and for city driving, it's great. I understand EVs work great in the cities, but for long distance driving and realistic driving, 'cause I do a lot of driving, realistic driving, look, 80% charge to maybe get 100 miles, no. And it take an hour or two, no. No, I made this trip 1,040 miles in 15 hours and like 30, well, more, probably more like 16 hours, right? But I made it in one stretch. One stretch. Um, I didn't stop to sleep. I didn't stop, anything like that. I mean, we had snacks in the vehicle and we just kept going. You know, if I had an EV, this distance would have probably taken me 2 or 3 days to do because you're constantly having to charge every 100 miles. And that charge is going to be anywhere between an hour to 2 hours. Okay, anyways, I'm going to save the rest of that rant for the actual EV versus reality. And let me tell you, and another thing, let's take the Ford F-150. I'm not sure what the fuel tank size in the F-150 is, right? But let's say it's 26 gallons, right? So if you can only, and the Lightning only gets 320 miles for a full charge, right? So let's compare that to another F-150 gas engine with a 26-gallon fuel tank, right? And so if you can only go 320 miles, right? Divide that by 26. That's only 12.3 miles to the gallon. That is only 12. You only if an EV at 320 miles of range, you're only that's equivalent to only compared to a 26-gallon fuel tank. That's only like 12.3 miles to the gallon, right? But the reality is it's probably worse, right? So let's say you only get like that TFL video. They charge it at full charge. It was like 281 miles or something like that. Let's say they divide that by 26, right? 26 gallons. That's 10.8 miles to the gallon. I don't know where they're getting these numbers of 34 miles per gallon equivalent or whatever. The full extended range battery can only give you 320 miles. Now let's compare that with the F-150 that has the 26-gallon fuel tank. That gets 22 or 23 miles. As a matter of fact, let's do that. Let's say, let's just do 20 miles to the gallon. Times that by 26 gallons. That's 520 miles. So what's better? That or the EV? I'll take the gas engine. Thank you very much. Anyways, that's enough of that. So I'm talking about regens with this RAM. During this entire 6,500 mile stretch, okay, I only recorded, let me see here, I think it was 3, right? 1, 2, there was another one in here, right there, 3. Okay, so yeah, I only recorded 3 active regens, and the way RAM does it, it goes into automatic regen after like X number of miles, right? It's like X number of like thousands of miles, right? And because I hadn't really monitored, unlike the Ford where I was monitoring the regens constantly, with the RAM, I don't really worry about regens because the DPF is directly behind the diesel oxidation catalyst, so it always stays hot. So it's always going to be in a passive regen. That's just kind of, and particularly if you do more highway drivings, you're always going to be in a passive regen. But my EzLynk 2, the first generation, didn't work on my 21. So when I was at Titan Fuel Tanks, I also got the EzLynk 2.0. And I began to monitor, of course, this is after Idaho Falls. So this is really from Idaho Falls to Washington and then back. I had noticed that between these active regens, right, that it wasn't, so I'd assumed that even though I may not see on the screen it says automatic regen, because when it does go into automatic regen or an active regen, the truck tells you. I had always assumed that every few hundred miles the truck would just do a little regen, right? With my truck and my experience coming back, that's not the case. The truck, because the DPF is directly behind the diesel oxidation catalyst, my EGTs remained within the regen temperatures, right? 575 or 577 degrees and higher. So it was always, for the most part, constantly regenning itself. It's always in a passive regen. And by the way, how you know you go into an active regen is when the EG valve position or the commanded EGR, either or, right, goes to 0. because in an active region, when the truck actually goes into regen, like it forces itself to go into regen, it does not pump any EGR. EGR goes to 0. And so during my entire trip, besides these active regens, right, the truck was always in a pet, because my EGTs particularly always high, and they were always high enough, so it was great. And the truck did not do any regens between these active regens, and I would go, I think I went like almost 3,500 miles between active regens, which was incredible. I was like, wow, there was no regens in between that 3,500 mile span. And I found that to be remarkable, because with the Ford, my Fords, every 500 miles, regardless if it needed or not, it would go into an active regen. But not only that, the soot level would go from 0 to 100% within, or 0 to 75% within that 500 miles. The Ford, let me tell you, their DPF system and their engines are dirty. It fills up quick, real quick. With my 21 Ram, my DPF soot load never went over 1 gram. That's it. As a matter of fact, and on my DPF gauge, it, for the most part, remained at 0. It always stays at 0. I've only seen it a couple times where it would go up like a quarter of the way, but that's about it. That happened like 2 or 3 times. That's it. In the 36,000 miles I've had this truck so far. My DPF pressure and delta pressure, typically, they don't get very high. As a matter of fact, my DPF pressure, I mean, I think the highest PSI on this trip I saw was 1. And the delta pressure, I think 0.6 PSI here was probably one of the highest. But for the most part, it remained pretty close together with a little bit, maybe 0.1 or 0.2 here, right? This maybe went to 1 at one time, but, you know, and this DPF soot load went to like 1 gram, and that's it. I never saw it get any higher than that, you know. Something also to note, EGR valve positioning. In the past, like I'll give you an example with like my 2011 Ram, I mean, it would pump a lot of EGR, right? It would be, I don't know, open like 50, 60, 80% or whatever, right? The 16 was the same way. The 18 was a little bit better. The 19 was a little bit better. It would pump less EGR, right? But this 21 Ram, let me tell you, this EGR valve position, the highest I've seen so far, I think was like 23% open. But for the most part, this remained at like 8 or 9, which I found incredible. This truck uses way less EGR, which might explain why it uses a lot more DEF. But hey, I will take less EGR for more DEF any day. But yeah, so that's also something very interesting to know. So, but yeah, so that's MPGs. And talking about MPGs, because I think I'll talk more about regens. But some of these higher mileage, like higher MPGs like this 30 and 34 and a lot of this stuff, I mean, I was doing some major hypermilling, because particularly after I got the Titan tank, I kind of want to see how far I could go. Particularly this last trip when I got home, right? This was from Oklahoma City all the way into Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. This is Highway 22 through 20, all the way up to Lexington, South Carolina, which is about like 20 minutes away from the house. That's where I filled up at. I filled up at the fuel station. And I could have made it to exit 87 off 20 to fill up at that Love's there. But I think the truck read an 1/8 of a tank over. I still had an 1/8 of a tank of fuel left, a little bit over 1/8 of a tank. But my concern, I didn't want to run it all the way to empty, because I was concerned. I read online that with these Titan or S&B tanks, some people have experienced like starvation when they get below a quarter tanks. I was getting a little bit worried about that, you know. But I was a little bit over 1/8 of a tank, so I could have made it that extra 20 miles to that final fuel station off exit 87, off Highway 20, exit 87, that Love station there. But I decided to fill up in Lexington, which is just 20 minutes from the house, so it's really not a big deal. So it's basically from OKC to, you know, basically home. And I drove 1,040 miles on one tank, and I had an 1/8 of it. And you see here, right? I filled up 43.6 gallons, which that out of a 52-gallon fuel tank, that 50. I'm sorry, I'm bad with math. I still had 8.4 gallons left, right? So if I'm getting 23.8 times that by 8.4, I still had 199.9 miles left of driving. And that's actually what the truck read. The truck did read roughly about 180, 190 miles left to the tank before it's like completely empty. So that means I could have drove this truck, 1,180 some miles on one tank. So that's really impressive. And let me tell you, you can indeed get good fuel mileage with these trucks. I know a lot of people have a hard time believing that, but I get good fuel economy because it's the way I drive. And yes, I do hypermill. I do that. I do what I can, drive at slower speeds, find a semi that's doing X number of miles, to the miles per hour, and I get behind them. I set my cruise, the not the cruise, but the automatic cruise control, where it detects, it'll slow you down, speed up, etc. And I just follow behind a semi. I try not to follow too close, but doing some of these. When I say major hypermilling, yeah, I was pretty close. I mean, the guy was probably really pissed off. And when he would change lanes, I would move with this semi. And I'm pretty sure I pissed a lot of them off. And I get it. I would be really mad too. But I was experimenting, trying to see what I can do to get good fuel economy, and so forth. So, anyways, but yeah. So, um, anyways, let's move on. So on my trip, right, I did call Titan Fuel Tanks and, hey, I wanted one of their 52-gallon fuel tanks installed, and the part number I got is 7030113, and I originally wanted it done at Titan Fuel Tanks in Idaho Falls, but they said that because of COVID they had stopped doing installs at their shop. They then recommended PowerTech Diesel and Power Labs Diesel, and this shop, if you know anything about Diesel Brothers and they got hit with the EPA fine, etc., well, this shop was the shop that was used to put all those trucks back to stock. That's what Titan said. And they highly recommended PowerTech Diesel to install their tanks. So I was like, okay. And not only that, PowerTech is just literally down the road from Titan Fuel Tank. So I was like, okay, cool. So Titan Fuel Tank, they actually got me scheduled with PowerTech because they were really good about that. Their customer service was great. And they gave me the name of the person to talk to at PowerTech, and I went ahead and talked to them as well, and said, hey, I'm coming in. I should be there on the 21st of June, which was a Tuesday. I'll drop the truck off in the morning, and then they'll get me in and out, and that's exactly what they did. So, and while I was there, I wanted to film it, but they were like, no, we don't want you to film in the shop, but they did allow me to take pictures while they were in the shop. So this is the outside of the building. This is the Titan fuel tank, not installed. And let me tell you, it's a big tank. It was huge. As you can see here, it's big, right? And I want you to notice something. There's this bulb, this little bulge of the tank, right? This is the front of the tank, and this sits flush with the frame rail, right? Anyways, you can see how much bigger this 52-gallon is compared to this 31. This is the factory tank. This is the Titan tank. I mean, just look at that. I mean, it huge. And this tank is solid. Like, I was really impressed with the quality build quality of this tank. So anyways, this is they also had one of these Titan, I guess, rolling around tanks where they can pump fuel out. So I actually had I had 3/4 of a tank left in my factory fuel tank. They were able to drain it out, and then they installed the Titan tank. And as you can see here, it doesn't sit too far underneath the frame rail when it's empty. When it's empty, that's important, because when the tank is full, that's a different story. And I mentioned this to Titan, and I've sent pictures, so hopefully they may either add another brace. I think they need a brace here to hold the front of this tank up, because you can see here, this right here and this right, this is where the tank straps go, right? You can see that, right? But there's no strap holding this front. Look how massive. There's a lot of fuel up here. So anyways, um, th this is what the tank looks like when it's empty. Now let's see what it looks like when it's full. As you can see, when the tank is full, it kind of hangs lower in the front. You can see here that this part, this bulge, is no longer flush with the frame. It sags a little bit, and it hangs about almost 3.5 inches below the DEF tank frame mount right here. But you can see here with the step down, it doesn't hang below like the step, which is great, but it still hangs pretty low. And this is the view of the truck with the tank. You can see that's got, you can see it. It definitely hangs low. And here's some more under shots of the tank. But you can see what I'm talking about. You see how it sags in the front because there's a lot of fuel not supported right here. There's a lot of, you can see the tank kind of bulging a little bit because of how much fuel that's in there. It's a lot. It's a lot of fuel. So, but I did call Titan, and I sent them some images. So maybe they will design it. S&B, their 52-gallon fuel tanks, it actually tapers up, right? So it'll come across and it tapers up. So it kind of flows with the frame. Whereas Titan, you got the frame, right? Frame and then bulge, and then it comes back up, and you can still see the tank, which is, the back of the tank is not bad, right? It doesn't hang too far down, but it's the front, that front part that hangs really low. But S&B, it kind of tapers into the DEF area, like right here, right? It tapers into it. So I kind of appreciate the way S&B had their tank designed like that. Something else I wanted to touch on. This is the this is the tank, right? That's not installed, and this side here is the side that's to the drive shaft. This bulge right here, and other people on forums, HDRAM forums, and other forums have said that the rear-mounted fuel filter gets really close and may touch the Titan fuel tank. Well, I mentioned the Titan, and they're like, well, it shouldn't. But they highly recommended PowerTech, and sure enough, when this tank was installed, this bulge was touching that rear-mounted fuel filter. So what PowerTech did was they unbolted the fuel filter, and it had two bolts. One was a slotted hole. The other was just a regular hole that the fuel filter bolts into. They had to kind of drill out that single hole so it looks like the slotted hole, and so they could shift the fuel filter. They were able to move the fuel filter away from the Titan fuel tank about 1/2 inch, so there's not a 1/2 inch clearance between the fuel tank and the fuel filter. So that's good, but it is something to note. I don't think a lot of people, when they get this stuff installed, they don't pay attention to that. Now, when the tank, particularly when the tank is full, it expands. It absolutely expands. And if it's not touching, if you got like a 1/4 inch of space between the tank and the fuel filter housing, once this tank is full, particularly if you're in like hot weather areas, right, it's going to touch that rear-mounted fuel filter. So I want you guys to be aware. You might have to unbolt that thing and kind of shimmy it over a little bit. But something else to note, and this is for Titan, S&B, their fuel tanks, they have a notch cut out right here that is purposeful, because that notch that's cut out of their tank is for that rear-mounted fuel filter housing, so it can fit here and not touch the tank. So might be something that Titan, you guys, that and this bulge right here, right? You go to right here, S&B has it tapering into the frame, right? So instead of this like 90-degree bulge, it just kind of flows into the frame. And it doesn't look like it's hanging super low like the Titan tank does when it's full. And this is when it's full, just FYI. So Titan, you might want to take care of that. Other than that, there's, and when PowerTech installed this tank, Titan recently changed these vent tubes. See, these are the vent tubes, right? Their older tanks had a cross-link tube that connected with the factory vent hose. But these new Titan tanks, they have these like shorty vent hoses. Well, when I was filling up my truck the first time after getting it installed, the tank was leaking. So I took it back to PowerTech and I was like, hey, it's leaking. So they checked everything. Everything was tight. But what they discovered was the vents were leaking on both sides. And so what they did was they just got new hose and they just ran new hose to lengthen the vent hoses, and they tucked them up underneath the bed. And when they did that, no more leaks. And I have now about 3,000 miles on this Titan tank since the initial install, and they fixed this vent issue. No leaks. So yeah, I now have 3,000 miles of usage out of this tank so far, because you don't really see a lot of videos out there. People talking about some people talk about their initial install, but they don't talk about the after effect, or their long-term review. Even though this is not a long-term review because I still relatively new, but at least I have 3,000 some odd miles on this tank, and so far so good. I'm happy with it. I'm impressed with it. The build quality is great, but again, there's always room for improvement, always, because this is a new tank. This is the Generation 6, because SMB had this O-ring, this factory style way of mounting the sending unit, whereas Titan, the original, they had like these 6 bolts or 8 bolts or whatever. Well, then Titan changed their design to be like SMB because they had to, because SMB, it's all OEM style fittings, right? So Titan had to change theirs. So again, Titan, I highly recommend. You might want to do something about this bulge. Either put a brace here or redesign this front part here to kind of taper up into the frame instead of this like 90-degree like bulge right there. So anyways, that's enough of that. Okay, now let's talk about EzLynk, the EzLynk 2.0. And let me tell you, when I got this thing installed, they were able to use the EzLynk 2.0 to adjust the, where is it? Set fuel tank capacity. So the truck it reads distance to empty correct. When full, the truck says I got well over 1,000 miles of range. And that's cool. And as the tank begins to drop, it's pretty accurate. Like I said, I was a little bit over 1/8 of a tank when I filled up last night after that long 1,040 odd some miles from OKC, Oklahoma to Lexington, South Carolina. And the truck was reading, I had like 180, 190 miles till empty from a little over 1/8 of a tank. And judging from the fuel mileage report itself, I filled up 43.6 gallons of fuel. That leaves like 8 some odd gallons left. And that's that, and you divide, times that by whatever, this miles per gallon. And sure enough, it was like 199.9 miles left. So it's pretty accurate. So it is accurate. The distance to empty is now accurate. But you can do it. I think SMB says you can't do it, but this EzLynk 2.0, this is the new EzLynk. And it does have the ability to change the fuel tank capacity. I don't know how new this is, but if you have the EzLynk 2.0, you can indeed update the fuel tank capacity up to 52 gallons. Not only that, the EzLynk 2.0, you can now do a stationary DPF regen. That's awesome. That is so cool. With the Ford, they have OCR, so I can do stationary regen. But in Ram, they didn't have that option. They don't have an OCR option. But now with the EzLynk 2.0, guess what? You can now do a stationary manual DPF regeneration in the parking lot or in your a safe area, wherever, but you can do it stationary now. And that's cool. That's really cool. There's a lot of features here that is available in the new EzLynk 2.0. And this is not a tuner. This is a diagnostic tool, right? So I'm not connected with a tuner or anything. I don't have any performance tunes or anything like that. The truck is 100% stock. But I got the EzLynk 2.0 mainly because I know that it can change the fuel tank capacity. But when I got this, I saw that you can do a DSUT, a stationary DPF regeneration. I'm like, wow, that's cool. I didn't even know that was available, but it is. So for those of you out there who may want to have that capability, hey, I recommend an EzLynk 2.0. So pretty cool stuff. Um, but yeah. So anyways, that's I think that's gonna wrap up this cross country trip review. Um, I plan to do another separate video about EVs versus reality, right? Like realistic driving. Um, and I'm probably gonna go in a huge rant about that because I can't really. You charge up, they recommend only 80%, and you may get like 100 miles. Rather, I know there's people, well, I get like 150 or maybe 200 miles. Okay, that's great, but let me tell you, what I don't like about that, okay, let's say you get an extra 200 miles of range. Well, that's dependent on how you drive, driving conditions, speed, terrain, etc. You're not going to get that full estimated. It's estimated 200 miles of range. Not only that, where's the reserve? What happens if you can't make the next charging station? TFL Truck proved that when they were doing that tow test with their Lightning. That young kid, he couldn't make it to the station to charge up, so he had to backtrack. Right? The truck said 100 and some miles. I'll make it, but the reality is he only got like 80 some miles while towing. That's the reality. What I like about this Titan fuel tank, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. What I like about the Titan fuel tank, I don't have to worry about range. I know that my truck, I know it's confirmed that I can get over 1,000 miles of range per tank, right? But what I love about this as well is that I don't need to go from full to empty, right? There's so much reserve. I can fill up at 858 miles or 500 miles or 700 miles, right? I can go these long distances and I don't have any range anxiety because I still know that I got X number of hundreds of miles to go. So I know I will always get to a fuel station. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? I don't like the idea of charging up to 80%, getting maybe 150, let's say miles, 200 miles, whatever, right, of range, right? But that, am I going to make it to the next charging station? What happens if I don't? What happens if you get to this charging station, and the station is down? Because there have been times when, in the past, you get to a fuel station and you think, because if you're in the middle of nowhere, right, for those city people who have never done a cross-country trip before, there are stations out there, there are places out there in the middle of nowhere. There may be like one gas station. And sometimes that one gas station will be decommissioned. What happens if you go to a charge station that's decommissioned? You're kind of screwed, aren't you? Just think about that. I don't like range anxiety. The EVs are not there today. The infrastructure for charging is not there. It's not. It's a gimmick. I do think it'll get better, but right now, it's just a gimmick. And not only that, it's, you know how much damage you're doing to the country, to the world, right? You climate change people, right? Complaining about fossil fuels. These EVs are way worse. Mining the material. Oh, and by the way, these electric stations, right? They're these where you get your juice from, right? Typically fired, right? It takes fossil fuel to make electricity. Just FYI. So just think about that. So, anyways, that's enough of that. Trust me, when I go into that EV versus reality, I'm gonna freaking go off on that because for you city people, I get it. It's good for the city. I actually I agree with that. I think that if you're in the city and you don't do long driving, I think the EVs are, if you want to get an EV, sure, go ahead. But for long distance driving, trucking industry, logistics, making America move, EVs, pipe dream. It's a pipe dream. So, anyways, right, I'm gonna shut her down here. That'll be it, and just look out for the other Eevee versus reality video. So I will catch you in the next one.